Pleasure doing business.
Yes.
Yes.
That's not the name on the term sheet.
No. Who are you? Someone who's been watching your company for 18 months and needed to know if you were ready for what comes next.
She did not reach for the contract. She did not call her lawyer. She sat back in her chair and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding, in real time, whether to be angry about it or learn from it. She said, "Talk." He said, "You didn't read clause 14. She said, "I read every clause." He said, "Read it again." She pulled the contract toward her. She found clause 14. She read it. The room went very quiet. Clause 14 was 11 lines long. It was written in standard contract language, dense, precise, unremarkable in isolation. What it said, in the specific combination of its terms, was that the minority stake sale triggered a right of first refusal on all remaining shares, exercisable within 90 days, at the valuation established in this agreement. The valuation she had accepted, the one she had negotiated down from, was 40% below current market. She had accepted it because the headline number had felt large. She had not run the dilution math on the clause that followed it. She set the contract down. She looked at him. She said, "If you exercise the right of first refusal at this valuation, you can acquire the remaining 60% for less than half what the company is worth." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's what this agreement allows." He said, "That's what this agreement allows." She said, "Did you write this clause?" He said, "No, your lawyer did. I suggested the valuation framework." He built the clause around it. Her lawyer had drafted clause 14. She had reviewed it. She had read it as a protective mechanism, a standard ROFR, nothing unusual. What she had not mapped was the interaction between clause 14 and the valuation she had agreed in clause 3. Two clauses, both standard in isolation. Together, a mechanism that gave the buyer the option to acquire her entire company at a price she had set herself, thinking she was being cautious. She had been cautious about the wrong number. He had given her 4 minutes at the window. He had not spoken because she did not need him to, and because he had learned over 20 years of negotiation that the most important thing you could do after delivering a complex truth was to give the other person the space to fully receive it. Rushing the moment was a beginner's mistake. He had not been a beginner for a long time. She turned around. She said, "You could have exercised that clause without telling me. You had 90 days. He said, "Yes." She said, "So why are you telling me now?" He said, "Because I don't want the company." She said, "Then what do you want?" He said, "I want you to understand what you almost lost. And then I want to have a different conversation." She sat back down. She looked at him with the direct assessment of someone who has recalibrated a situation and is now operating in the new version of it. She said, "Who are you?" Actually. He opened the plain black notebook on the table. He placed one card in front of her. She read it. She looked up. She said, "You're Daniel Shaw." He said, "Yes." She said, "Vertex Capital." He said, "Yes." She said, "You've been watching my company for 18 months. He said, "Since the Series A. I was in the room. You didn't see me." He had first seen Cova Tech at a Series A pitch 18 months ago. He had not been an invited investor. He had come with a colleague who was. Zara had presented for 22 minutes. She had made 3 arguments that were genuinely original, not dressed up conventional thinking, actually new. He had written 4 words in the black notebook. This one. Watch carefully. He had not introduced himself. He had gone home and begun reading everything about her company that existed in public form. The night of the pitch, Lena had asked him what he was writing. He had said, "Notes on a company." She had said, "Is it good?" He had said, "The person running it is exceptional. The company has a structural problem she doesn't know about yet." Lena had said, "Are you going to tell her?" He had said, "Not yet." Lena had gone back to her book. She had said, without looking up, "That seems mean." He had said, "It would be meaner to tell her before she's ready to hear it." Zara had built Cova Tech on a problem she had experienced personally, enterprise software that claimed to integrate with existing systems and never quite did. She had spent 8 months building a platform that actually solved it, for months finding the first client who'd risk using it, and 3 years turning that client into 40. The company's NPS score was 91. Its churn rate was 4%. Both of those numbers were extraordinary. She knew it. So did Daniel Shaw. The structural problem was in the cap table. Zara owned 51% of Cova after the Series A. Her two co-founders, who had left the company in year 2, still held a combined 19% with no vesting cliff on their remaining shares. If Cova raised a Series B at a valuation above $40 million, the co-founders' shares would trigger an anti-dilution clause that would reduce Zara's stake to below 40%, below the threshold required for her to block a board resolution. She would lose effective control of her own company without anyone selling a single share. 6 months after the Series A, Zara had begun Series B conversations. 3 firms had been interested. 2 had pulled back after due diligence, both citing the cap table structure without explaining why precisely. She had read their withdrawal letters as market hesitation. She had moved on to the next conversation. Daniel had read the withdrawal letters as confirmation of what he already knew and had made a decision about timing. He had set up Meridian Partners, the shell entity, through a firm he used for exactly this kind of structure. Not to deceive for the sake of deception. To create the conditions in which the real conversation could happen. If he had approached Zara as Daniel Shaw, Vertex Capital, she would have prepared for that meeting for 3 weeks, brought advisors, built defenses. He needed to see her unguarded. He needed to see how she handled a situation she hadn't fully mapped. What he had seen in the meeting room was the answer he was looking for. Zara had spent 4 weeks negotiating the Meridian term sheet. She had pushed the valuation up 8% from the opening offer. She had negotiated board representation, information rights, anti-dilution provisions. She had been thorough on every term she had been trained to be thorough on. Clause 14 had not been on that list. It had appeared in the final draft, a late edition, and her lawyer had flagged it as standard, and she had accepted that because she was managing 14 other things that week and she trusted her lawyer and she was running out of time. She said, "Why the structure? Why Meridian? Why not just approach me?" He said, "Because I needed to see how you handled pressure you hadn't prepared for." She said, "And," he said, "you sat back. You didn't call your lawyer. You didn't get angry. You said talk." That's the response of someone who knows that the most important thing in a bad situation is to understand it before you react to it. He paused. "Most people don't do that," she said. "Most people haven't built a company alone." He opened the notebook to page 43. He turned it to face her. It showed her cap table, her current one, post-Series A. Below it, a projected table showing what happened at a $40 million Series B valuation. The numbers were precise. The outcome was clear. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "The anti-dilution clause." He said, "On your co-founder shares." She said, "I'd lose control of my own board." He said, "At 41 million. You've had 2 term sheets above that threshold." Both walked. She had known something was wrong with the Series B conversations. She had told herself it was market conditions, investor hesitation, the usual friction of raising capital in a crowded sector. She had not gone back to the cap table. She had not sat with the 2 withdrawal letters long enough to read the specific language in each one, both of which, she now understood, had been pointing at exactly this. She had been too busy running her company to look carefully at the structure that controlled it. She said, "So you've spent 18 months building a picture of my company's structural vulnerability. You engineered a contract that gives you the option to acquire it at below market value. You've told me about the co-founder cap table problem. And you say you don't want the company." She looked at him. "So, what exactly is it that you want?" He said, "I want to show you how to fix it. And then I want to invest at the right valuation through a structure that actually protects you." He had laid it out in 15 minutes. The co-founder shares could be restructured through a secondary sale. He would facilitate it at fair value, taking the shares off the cap table and clearing the anti-dilution trigger before the Series B. With the cap table clean, A 45 million valuation was achievable and Zara would retain control above 50%. The Meridian contract, the one she had signed, could be voided under a mutual rescission clause he had included in Section 9. She had not read Section 9 either. Section 9 allowed for mutual rescission within 48 hours of signing by written agreement of both parties, with no penalty to either side. She set the contract down. She looked at him. She said, "You built the door in." He said, "I always build the door in." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because a deal that someone can't exit isn't a deal. It's a trap. I don't build traps." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Then why build the trap at all?" He said, "To see if you'd read the door." She said, moving, "You facilitated a deal structure designed to show me a flaw I hadn't found, using a contract you never intended to enforce, with an exit clause that makes the whole thing reversible." She stopped. She looked at him. "That is an extraordinarily complicated way to make a point." He said, "The point was worth making correctly." She said, "What's the point?" He said, "That you built something exceptional and are about to lose control of it because you trust your own instincts more than you verify the details underneath them. I did the same thing at 31. It cost me my first company." He had told her briefly, 3 minutes, no dramatization. His first company at 31. A licensing agreement he had signed on the basis of a verbal assurance from someone he trusted, without reading the definition of exclusive in Clause 7. The definition had been non-standard. He had lost the right to license his own technology to competitors for 5 years. The company had not survived the restriction. He had rebuilt from the wreckage and had not signed a document he hadn't read word by word since that day. He said, "I'm not telling you this to be wise. I'm telling you because it's the same mistake." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You spent 18 months watching me build toward the same mistake you made." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you decided to let me get to the edge of it before you stopped it." He said, "I decided to let you get close enough that the lesson would stay. If I told you at the pitch, you'd have fixed the cap table and moved on, and the habit of not verifying would still be there." She looked at the contract on the table. She said, "The habit." He said, "The habit is the thing that costs you." The door had opened at 4:30. Lena had come straight from school. Daniel had arranged for the building's reception to collect her from the lobby when she arrived, as he always did when a meeting ran past 4 o'clock. She had looked at the room, the contract on the table, the young woman across from her father, the specific quality of the silence between them. She had said, "Are you done?" He had said, "Nearly." She had sat in the corner chair and opened her notebook. Zara had watched her for a moment. Lena had looked up from her notebook and said, "Are you the one who didn't read Clause 14? Zara had blinked. She had said, "He told you about that?" Lena had said, "He tells me about the interesting cases. He said yours was the most interesting in 3 years. Zara had looked at Daniel. He had been looking at the table. Zara had said to Lena, "What else did he say?" Lena had said, "That you built something real. That's what he said first." She had gone back to her notebook. He watched Zara watch Lena for a moment. There was something in the way Zara's expression had changed when Lena said, "He said yours was the most interesting in 3 years." A shift from the professional mode she had been operating in towards something more human. He had noticed this. It mattered to him not for any tactical reason, but because the people he chose to work with were always, in some way, visible in moments exactly like this one. She had said, "If we rescind the Meridian contract, what does the actual deal look like?" He had opened the notebook to a clean page and handed her the pen. He had said, "You tell me what you need. I'll tell you what's workable." She had looked at the pen in her hand. She had said, "That's not how term sheets get written." He had said, "That's exactly how the good ones do." She had written for 11 minutes. Valuation anchor, control threshold, board composition, use of funds, information rights, exit provisions. She had been precise on every term. This was her territory, the operational and financial architecture of her company, and she knew it better than anyone. When she stopped writing, he had read the page and made 4 small marks. He said, 3 of these I can meet exactly. One needs a conversation. She said, which one? He said, the valuation anchor. You've gone above what the market will support right now. She said, what will the market support? He said a number. She looked at it. She said, 6 months ago that would have been enough. He said, in 6 months, with the cap table clean, it'll be the floor. Lena had been writing in her notebook for the past 40 minutes. She was not writing about the meeting. She had started a list months ago, things that looked like one thing but were actually another. On the way over in the car that afternoon, her father had explained in 3 sentences what the Meridian contract was. Not all of it enough. It had gone on the list immediately. Now she added another item. A person who hands you the pen. She had said, the co-founder shares, the secondary sale you'd facilitate. What do you get from that? He said, nothing directly. It removes the structural problem. She said, you'd spend capital buying out co-founders who don't work here anymore, with no upside on those shares, just to clean the cap table for a deal that benefits me more than you. He said, the deal benefits both of us if the company reaches its potential. The cap table problem prevents that. Removing it is a prerequisite, not a concession. She said, most investors don't think that way. He said, most investors are optimizing for the wrong time frame. She had picked up the pen. She had looked at the terms on the page. She had said, I'm going to want my own lawyer to review this structure independently. He said, of course. She said, not the lawyer who drafted Clause 14. He said, I'd recommend against it, yes. She had almost smiled. She had said, and you'll void the Meridian contract? He said, written rescission, tonight, both parties. She said, then I think we have something to work with. She had written her initials beside the agreed terms, one by one. He had watched her do it. At the door she had said, you could have told me about the cap table at any point in the last 18 months. He said, yes. She said, why didn't you? He said, because information without context doesn't change behavior. You needed to feel the shape of the problem before the solution would mean anything. She looked at him. She said, that is either the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done in a deal process or the most arrogant. He said, probably some of both. She said, at least you're honest about that. In the corridor, Lena had shown Zara the list. Zara had read it, things that looked like one thing but were actually another. Near the bottom, in fresh ink, a person who hands you the pen. Zara had read it twice. She had said, what does that mean? Lena had said, Dad handed you the pen instead of writing the terms himself. That means he already knew they'd be right. Zara had looked back at Daniel. He had been looking at the exit sign, which meant he had heard every word. She had sat in her office until 7 o'clock. She had not reviewed the terms again. She had memorized them. She had sat with the day. She had built Cova Tech by trusting her instincts and moving fast and being right about enough things that the time she was wrong didn't define her. She understood, sitting in her office in the quiet, that what Daniel Shaw had done, the elaborate structure, the contract, the Clause 14 had not been hostile. It had been the most expensive lesson anyone had ever paid to teach her, at his own expense. She was going to learn it correctly. At home, Lena had asked, did she understand? He had said, yes. She said, will she remember it? He said, the ones who sit with it instead of reacting, they remember it. She wrote something in her notebook. He said, what are you writing? She said, that the second time you sign something, you read Section 9 first. He looked at her. He said, that's correct. She said, I know. She closed the notebook and finished her dinner. She had called a senior team meeting the following morning. She had drawn the cap table on the whiteboard, the current one, the projected one at Series B, the anti-dilution trigger. She had explained the co-founder shares, the 2 investor withdrawals, what they had actually been communicating. Her CFO had gone very still. Her head of legal had asked why this hadn't surfaced earlier. She had said, because I was moving too fast to verify what I thought I already knew. That stops today. She had not mentioned Daniel Shaw's name yet. The secondary sale had taken 3 weeks to negotiate. The co-founders had been surprised to receive the offer. They had not been involved with the company for 2 years and had assumed the shares were simply accumulating value passively. The price Daniel had proposed was fair, which Zara had verified independently before presenting it. Both co-founders had accepted. The cap table, when the sale completed, showed Zara at 58%. The anti-dilution trigger was gone. The Series B conversation could begin again from solid ground. The Series B had closed 8 weeks after the cap table was restructured. Vertex Capital, through its main entity, not a shell, not a structure, just the firm with its real name, had led the round at a valuation that cleared the number Zara had written in the notebook. She had read every clause. She had asked questions about 4 of them. He had answered all 4 completely. When she reached section 9, she had looked up at him. He had said, "Door still in." She had said, "Good."
She had signed.
Lena had said, standing outside Cova's office on the morning of the Series B announcement, "Is it hers now?" Properly, Zara had been the one who answered. She had said, "It was always mine. Now the structure matches." Lena had considered this. She had written something in her notebook. Zara had asked what. Lena had read it aloud. The structure should match the truth. Zara had looked at Daniel. He had looked at the building. He had said, "That goes in the notebook."